This is Duke University.
So it's great to see you all here. Let me say that I'm Bill Schmiedis, Dean of the Nichols School of the Environment. And the reason I try to remember that is some of you might, a few of you might remember that I was introducing a speaker last year in a public forum, and I got about 3 or 4 minutes into the speech and someone raised their hand in the back, and it's like, I'm just getting started, you know. And I said, who are you? So, I thought everybody knew who I was, but anyway. So it says here, good morning and welcome to the Nichols School of the Environment's first presentation of the year of the Corporate Connections Lecture Series. At the Nichols School, we of course believe that within the private sector lies one of our greatest opportunities to realize our vision of creating a sustainable way of living and a sustainable future. And we have been working as diligently as we can to deepen our connections, increase our opportunities for our students to move into the corporate sector if they so desire. Our mission in life as a School of the Environment is to infiltrate as many areas as we possibly can, to the extent that at some distant future there'll no longer be a necessity for a School of the Environment, because the environment will have infused everything so profoundly that we will no longer need to exist. So this is part of that plot. And we are very, very pleased to mention that you know that we now have a new certificate in sustainability systems analysis. And next year we'll be starting a new certificate in environmental entrepreneurship. One is sort of an intrapreneurship activity, the other is an entrepreneurship activity, and certainly the intrapreneurship activity will be really very relevant for the folks of you who want to go work at wonderful places around the world in the corporate sector. Today's lecture is this year's first opportunity to meet with a current leader in sustainability and to hear her insights into the latest trends and innovations in environmental management and sustainability in the private sector. I know that you will find our time with ExxonMobil's Sherri Stuewer both interesting and thought-provoking. She is a remarkable person who has started out at one of those semi-Ivy League schools in the Northeast called Cornell, and has risen to an incredibly important place, working, really leading ExxonMobil's work in the sustainability area, and we're sure to look forward to hearing a lot from her. She'll be speaking with us today, and I think she'll be having a formal get-together with our students this afternoon. And I think it is my pleasure now to ask Javier Lascarrain, one of our leaders in the Nichols School Business and Environment Club and co-presenters of the Corporate Connections Lecture Series, to officially introduce our guest lecturer. Javier.
Thank you, Dean Committees. Good morning. On behalf of the Nichols School's Business and Environment Club, I am pleased to introduce Mrs. Sherri Stuewer, who is Vice President for Environment and Policy Planning for ExxonMobil Corporation. Mrs. Stuewer, who lives with her family in Dallas, earned her bachelor's and master's degrees at Cornell University, where she's an emeritus trustee. Over her 35-year career with ExxonMobil, she has held a variety of technical and managerial positions in refining, planning, and logistics. Prior to her current assignment, Mrs. Stuewer was Vice President for Safety, Health, and Environment, and before that, Strategic Planning Manager, General Manager of the Exxon Company USA Supply Department, and Manager of the Exxon Refinery in Baytown, Texas. In her current role at ExxonMobil, Mrs. Stuewer develops and coordinates ExxonMobil's worldwide efforts to address emerging environmental issues, including climate change. She's also a past chair of the Industry Advisory Board to the International Energy Agency and a former trustee for the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences. In a speech she made a few years ago at a business sustainability conference, Mrs. Stuewer explained that to ExxonMobil, sustainability is a balancing act, balancing economic growth, social development, and environmental protection so that future generations are not compromised by actions taken today. Today, She will tell us more about how ExxonMobil and the oil and gas industry overall are striving to achieve that balance. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Stuewer.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you. Thank you. And please call me Sherri. After being married more than 30 years, if you say Mrs. Stuewer, I still think you're talking about my mother-in-law. And I need to change the bio because when it says I've been with ExxonMobil 35 years, it's really hard to lie about your age then. But I am very pleased to have the opportunity to talk with you. And as it was mentioned, I'll have a chance to talk a little bit this afternoon about my career and about career opportunities as I see them in the area of environment and sustainability. I'm going to talk from the material that I've got here for maybe 40 minutes, and then we'll do questions and answers, and I would welcome the interaction. And if you want to, while I'm going through the charts, ask a question, just stick up your hand. That's fine. I would like to make it interactive. I have a little bit of material to start this, which is a kind of a big picture energy outlook, because I think that's a good backdrop to the rest of the discussion. Then I have just a quick snapshot of what I'll call the competitive landscape that we in ExxonMobil operate. Then I'll talk about how we got to where we are in our thinking about sustainability. And I'll close by talking about two issues that are kind of foremost right now in my portfolio in the environment and sustainability area. The first is water, and the second is greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a lot of material we're going to try and go through, but again, please feel free to interrupt. Let's see if I can make this work. Good. We do internal to ExxonMobil every year an assessment of what global energy supply and demand are going to look like. We call it our energy outlook. It's very much like what the International Energy Agency does each year. We do this, though, for our business planning purposes. This provides a backdrop for our investment. But we talk about it outside because we think it helps to build energy literacy. And we start, and we do more than 100 countries. We look at demand sectors and supply options and build it up. But when you look at it at a macro standpoint, the two things that have the biggest impact in driving energy demand are population growth and GDP growth. And the little graph on the right shows what we think the demand growth will be for energy globally. And from 2005 to 2030, it's about a 35% increase. The good news is it could have been a whole lot worse than that. If you look at that yellow line that grows there, if in 2005 you had frozen the intensity, energy intensity of our economies at the level it was in 2005 and still grew the economies, you would have had an extra 300 quads of energy. So there is built into this a lot of energy efficiency or energy intensity reductions. And if you look at the assumptions that we have going forward on energy intensity improvements, it's about a 1.5% per year improvement in energy per unit of GDP. That is faster than, say, the last 30 years. The last 30 years, you had a little bit less than 1% improvement in energy intensity per unit of GDP. So some people might say this is aggressive. We're not too far out of line with the IEA, but we anticipate the need for both policy and price influencing that pace of energy efficiency gains. Now, it doesn't come as a surprise that you see a very different pattern of energy use in the developed world, or the OECD countries, and the developing world. And you can see that the predominant growth in energy globally out to 2030 will be in the developing world. China is actually the largest source of growth, but if you look at the fastest growth from a percentage standpoint, it's India and Africa. And we are starting now to extend our horizon out to 2040. And what you see is China starts to roll over and grow much more slowly, and India and Africa start to be the drivers for growth as you get beyond 2030. This kind of demand growth, when you look at it by sector, what you see underneath is that if you look at the transport sector, what's growing most rapidly in transport is heavy-duty transport. It's trucks associated with that economic development. If you look at industry, industry is actually the largest growth sector in energy out through this time horizon. And the fastest segment of energy growth is the electricity sector, as demand for electricity grows in the developing world. And what you see behind that is a tremendous importance placed on what the mix of fuels are will be providing that electricity growth. And I'll talk a little bit about that on the next chart, because this next chart says, so this is sort of, if you will, the demand side. This is the supply side now. And these bars show the various sources of energy, and the little dotted lines show where we were in 2005, and the top of the bar is 2030, and the little numbers above the bar are the per year growth in that particular fuel. So what you see is if you look at oil and coal, their per year growth is below the total energy growth. Total energy growth is about 1.2% per year. So basically coal and oil are losing market share over this horizon. And what you see is gas growing at 2%, much faster than total energy. So it's gaining market share. So what happens is essentially gas leaped over coal to be the second largest source of energy by 2030, where right now it's third. By 2030 it will leap over. Part of that is supported by the rapid growth in shale gas in parts of the world, and this gas is growing rapidly in the electricity sector. So as you have electricity growing, you've got a lot of coal, particularly in India and China, going into electricity, but elsewhere the growth is strongly in the gas area. Now you can see the biomass bar there? That's not biofuels, that's predominantly wood and dung, which is still used many places around the world for energy, growing very slowly. Then nuclear, and as we debate what to do in our new outlook with the Japan incident, I suspect that number is going to come down a little bit in our next outlook. It's certainly not going to go away. I mean, the growth is not going to stop, but that number is going to come down a little bit. You can see small growth in hydro and geo. It's very much limited by the places where that will work. And then wind, solar, and biofuels growing at nearly 10% a year. Very rapid growth, but from a small base. So even by 2030, they represent a fairly small part of the total mix. So that's the backdrop that kind of goes behind. Now let me talk the next two slides a little bit about the picture of ExxonMobil. You probably think of ExxonMobil as a big energy company, and this tries to put this in perspective. Out of that total energy, global energy that is produced and consumed every year, ExxonMobil supplies about 2%. Of the resources for oil and gas that are known in the world, we have on our books, our shareholders' books, about 3%. Our refining capacity, right now we have 36 refineries globally, is about 7%, and our ethylene capacity, which is the basic building block for the petrochemical business, we're about 6%. So this is an enormous market, and we're a very significant player. And who do you think our primary competitors are? We are actually the 15th largest company in the world when you look at proved resources, which is kind of what is the potential for continued production. And you'll notice that there aren't any other privately held, shareholder-held companies on this list. Shell and BP are essentially off the list at the bottom. Our primary competitors are these national oil companies. And that, for sustainability, is an important issue, because when we operate around the world, we operate to the same high standards every place we do business. Not everybody above us on this list is operating to those same standards. So from a competitive standpoint, sustainability is a relevant issue when you're talking about this cast of competitors. And I wanted to lay that out so that you could have in the back of your head what our world looks like. Okay, so enough background. Let me launch into sustainability. Actually, the little comment that Javier read came from our 2009 corporate citizenship report. And do we have the stick drives? Are they up here? Oh, okay. Afterwards, if you would like, I have stick drives that have our corporate citizenship report on it, and you're welcome to have one if you would like. I came in looking like a bag lady carrying them, so I'd be delighted if you took some. I would tell you that in the oil and gas industry, the word sustainability has some difficulty for us, because if you think about oil and gas as a fossil fuel, it's finite and it's depleted over time, that's sort of inconsistent with the concept of sustainability. And so the industry really struggled to say, what could sustainability mean to us? How do we, fit into this? And in the late 80s, when the UN Commission that was headed by Dr. Brundtland came up with sort of the classic sustainability definition, I think that helped us, because it sort of got us to starting to think about, what could we do today in providing energy which is important for economic development and the quality of life? And how could we do that in a way that doesn't compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs? And that led us to this definition. And so for us, it was a hump to get over to even sort of internalize what sustainability as a word could mean to us. Now, we still prefer to use corporate citizenship. And there is a reason that we use that. And sustainability to us is a set of obligations that we look at. It's a way of looking at the world and disciplining our business for meeting to allow future generations to meet their needs. Corporate citizenship has two pieces. It has that sustainability obligations, but corporate citizenship also means we have certain rights as a company. And so we actually prefer to talk about citizenship because it has both the responsibilities of citizenship and the rights of citizenship. And so if you ask 99% of the people in ExxonMobil, they would use those two terms interchangeably, and I probably will today just out of habit. But I thought it might be useful for you to understand a little bit of the distinction between the two.
Can you tell us what includes the corporate rights in this context?
Well, I think that the corporate rights is if you, under rule of law, you have fair treatment under rule of law. I think that would be the number one right, that you can expect where you're doing business that, for us it's particularly important because when we go into a country to invest, we expect to be there maybe for 100 years. And so you're putting a lot of money on the ground, a lot of capital on the ground to start with, and rule of law and a respect for rule of law is really important for us over the long term. And I like to, people talk about, in our business we can get thrown out of countries, and have to walk away from investment. And I like to remind people we've been thrown out of Europe twice. So it can happen. It is part of our business. It's part of managing the portfolio of risk that we have in our business. But so as we came up with this definition of sustainability, then we started saying, what are the aspects of that for us? And clearly managing climate risks is one. I'll talk about greenhouse gases, economic development. And that's particularly important to us as a company because we do a lot of work in places where there's a desperate need for economic development. And there's this idea of a resource curse. You probably heard that, the idea that resources don't necessarily lift the economy. So the challenge for us is to figure out how to use things like the transparency initiative and that sort of thing to make sure that the value of a resource in a country actually can be for the economic development there. Human rights and security, huge issue for us, and one where we do a lot of training not only for our own employees, but for our contractors in places where human rights and security kind of have the risk of colliding. Corporate governance, this is obviously a huge issue, something that's of direct importance to our shareholders. Safety, health, and the workplace, this is an area that I've been directly involved in the last many years, and our environmental performance. Now, I want to talk about some of the pressures that I see, and this is a chart that I actually put together to use in discussions inside the company to talk to people about what I see the evolution of corporate citizenship and the pressures that I see that are shaping our citizenship responsibilities. One of the things that should not be at all surprising is that rapid global growth has a tremendous impact on the pressure for citizenship. As growing population and growing GDP consumes more water, consumes more land, consumes other finite resources, it creates a scarcity that raises the importance of resource management in all ways. And I had the opportunity a couple of months ago to meet with the head of DG Environment in the EU. And the EU is, I think, changing from a view of regulating environmental emissions to looking at resource intensity in Europe and trying to figure out how they can reduce the intensity of their economies. And this represents lots of different kinds of resources. And I think it is, if you will, it's an evolution in the thinking that is in response to the growth of the economies globally. The second thing that creates pressure for change is new science. And you probably are well aware that there is an emerging science in biomonitoring, which is the ability to detect in our bodies very minute quantities of chemicals that are not naturally occurring. And this technology has tremendous potential for the medical science to help us with diagnostics. The risk to a company that makes chemicals is that you could have a knee-jerk reaction to this data on the presence because we don't fully understand what the significance of that presence is. And if presence is assumed to equal harm, then it becomes a challenge for us. So one of the things that new science does for us is often at the front end of new science, there's not complete understanding, and that presents real challenges for us as a company that produces chemicals. Lower risk tolerance. My observation is that as societies get more developed, their risk tolerance goes down. They can afford the luxury of being less tolerant of risk. The challenge for us as a company, when we look at risk tolerance, and we respect the right of societies to choose that risk, but we would like for them to choose it in a transparent way where they talk clearly about the risks and the benefits. They understand the science of the risks and they understand the economics of the benefits. And that kind of transparent discourse is absolutely essential to having societies make those risk decisions in a good way. And the last thing is globalization. And globalization means a lot of things, but to me it means the interconnection of our world, the ability through the internet for people all over the world to understand what sustainability issues are like, which means that we can go to very remote areas and it's very clear that the local NGOs have expectations around everything from biodiversity, human rights, you name it. And they're getting this information through their connectivity. And so globalization works in the sustainability space, and that creates challenges for us as a business. So those things happen, and the implication for us is we clearly have increased scrutiny. We have expanded reporting requirements, and sometimes those are mandated, but sometimes they are voluntary in the sense that we need to do them in order to be credible. And part of what our citizenship report is about is making sure we're living up to expectations on reporting requirements. Now, you can also see new legislation and regulation. We see this globally in areas related to, that are covered by the sustainability umbrella. And the one that is of real concern to us is when concerns about these factors and the non-financial performance, it turns into limitations on access to resources. Because you remember those, our competitors. National oil companies don't face necessarily those same kinds of restrictions that we would as a shareholder-held company in the Western world. So this is what I've been telling the inside of the company is the sort of the framework, the world that we see on sustainability. And I want to talk about what I'll call a case study. And I looked back at some of the other speakers that you've had in this session, and many of them have talked about sustainability in terms of green products. And we certainly look at green products as being an important element in what I'll call our customer-facing business, which is chemicals and lubricants. For much of our business, the extractive industry part of our business, sustainability means something very different than green products. Sustainability means going to a place like Papua New Guinea to develop billions of dollars of investment for natural gas production. And Papua New Guinea is sort of the poster child for a green development. I mean, it's, if you look at brownfield development, greenfield development, this is area that is so rugged, it's never been charted. The nature there, the biodiversity that you see is astounding. Most of the people there are not literate. They live very closely connected to the natural environment and basically have no governance outside of their local tribe. They have specific languages that are unique to them. So development in Papua New Guinea is basically a sustainability challenge for us. We want to do this in a way that 60, 80 years from now, when Papua New Guinea is much more integrated into the developed world, they can look back and say, this was a positive start to it. And so we will probably have startup in 2014, and we've been working on this now for several years. The first step was an environmental impact statement, and it actually was, in our jargon, it was both environmental and social impact. And as a part of preparing that, which was submitted back in 2009, there were 24,000 interviews with people who will be living someplace along this development. Our development, the actual drilling will be in the highlands, and then there'll be about a 450-mile pipeline which goes down to the shore, and there'll be a liquefied natural gas plant there at the shore which will take the LNG and it will be sold into Asian markets. But 24,000 interviews of people to understand what were the significant issues of concern to them. And we did biodiversity studies at 78 sites along this development path, and in the course of that discovered 80 new species that were not known prior to this. We're right now working with Conservation International and a number of local NGOs on a biodiversity protection plan, and that plan, there are very unique land ownership practices in Papua New Guinea. And so Conservation International is helping us with how to manage the biodiversity impacts given the kind of shared ownership of land there. And probably by early next year, we'll have that plan in place. And what we expect to do is put a large endowment in place, which over the next 20, 30 years will continue to fund this biodiversity protection plan. Another thing that we did, and we have a strong commitment whenever we go into countries that we use a lot of in-country labor, both for construction and for the operation. Typically, you'll find that an ongoing operation has 90+% national content employees. And the construction will be highly dependent on local labor. So one of the first things we had to do was start a construction training institute so we could get people trained in not just the techniques of it, but also the safety issues. And I will tell you that this year, and I'll put my old hat on as an SNH&E vice president, our worst safety performance has been Papua New Guinea. And we have a huge challenge right now that we're facing to get Papua New Guinea to the point where the workers there understand the culture that's necessary to operate as a leader in safety, which is the way ExxonMobil operates. So construction training with a big healthy dose of safety training has been going on since last year. And then The other thing we want to do is we believe using what we call local content, national content, buying services and materials from local suppliers is really important. In this case, we needed to do some training and to build capacity of local suppliers. First of all, you have to make them understand we don't pay bribes, period. End of story. And we have expectations about how accounting is done and how payments are made, how deadlines are met. And we basically are having to build capacity in the suppliers there so that as we go through the different stages of this development, we can use local content. And then the other thing we're doing is investing in strategic community needs. And probably at the front end of that, the biggest investment is in local health. We put more than $20 million into the health infrastructure, and that's very important in Papua New Guinea. It's a high malaria area, and we are fanatical about protecting both our contractors and our employees from malaria. And the other thing is that one of the realities when you bring a workforce together to build something like this, you have to deal with social diseases, sexually transmitted diseases. And so one of the things we have to focus on is building the local health infrastructure so that people in the local community will be protected against that. So this is what sustainability means to us more than green products. And so I wanted to put that out there because it's different than what you will hear when you hear consumer products people talk about sustainability, meaning green products to them. And it's been interesting because I have struggled in this sustainability role to find a network of companies who I can work with who are facing some of these same issues. I go to these company sustainability meetings and everybody's talking green products, and my challenges are in areas like this. So I wanted to put that out there. Now, let me talk, I said I was going to talk about water and then greenhouse gases. So let's shift and talk about water. Water is incredibly important in the energy industry because it takes water to produce energy, and it also takes energy in most places of the world, parts of the world, to have clean water. So there's sort of an interaction between energy and water that is fundamental. And like the growth in energy, the growth in the demand for water, it's tied to both population and GDP, and this is a UNESCO chart. And what you can see on the right is there's a forecast for a fairly dramatic increase in the demand for water. The withdrawal rates are going to go up, and underneath that you can see the consumption rates rising. Now, it already, in many, many parts of the world, we are exceeding the capacity of freshwater supplies to meet demands. The WHO has indicated that 20% of the people live in areas where water is scarce, and another 25% live in areas where the infrastructure for delivering water is insufficient. So we're feeling the pinch. Now, why is that relevant to the energy industry? Oil and gas consumes about 2% of global water. Agriculture is about 70%, and the power generation sector is 20%. But the reality is, if you're tight, any kind of industry is going to feel the pinch because we're going to be down the pecking order for the priority for water. So water for us is a critical issue that we see that we have to focus on to make sure that we can enable our development. Now, there's another reason that water is particularly important in energy, and that is because as the type of energy sources are diversifying, we're kind of climbing up this chart, which shows barrels of water per barrel of oil equivalent energy, or think of it as barrels per BTU. And what you can see is that gas has traditionally been the least energy intense source of, at least water intense source of energy. Shale gas a little bit more than the conventional and tight gas, but still low compared to petroleum. But then you can see as you start to step up, bitumen is oil sands from Canada or from Venezuela, and you can produce them in situ, which means that you drill and generally inject steam to warm the oil and then produce it, or by mining. And then you can see turning coal into liquids, either by liquefaction or by a gas to liquids process. This is a tremendously energy intensive process right now, but there are many places in the world that have coal reserves that are seeing this as important for energy security, China as a leader. And you can see that it's very water intensive. And then of course you have biofuels at the top, which are off the chart. Now, if you remember that I said that the fastest growing demand segment right now is the power sector, this lays in water intensity for electricity. If you're producing electricity from coal, it's 11 to 20, so you're way out on the right-hand side. Nuclear is essentially on the right-hand side and off the chart. And natural gas goes from really low to up in this range right here. So water is critical not only for the original source of the energy, but as the power generation sector grows globally, there's a tremendous increase in the demand for water. So water is really relevant to our business. So as we started to think about this about 5 years ago, we sort of said the first thing we need to do is get better metrics. We need to know what's going on. And so we had basic consumption metrics on all of our operations, but we didn't know whether it was gray water or brine water or what. So we started to collect layers of data. The other thing we said is water is very important as a local issue. There are some places where water supplies are tight and some places where they're not. So then we set out to say, okay, well, let's focus on the areas where water is scarce. And we had a hard time actually figuring that out. We had to get a database, and we've actually put together several databases, and the University of New Hampshire probably has one that's been most helpful for us. And we cataloged all of our sites globally to understand where they were. And the gray area does not mean we don't know where those sites are. We know where our operations are. We just have not yet been able to get a good characterization of the scarcity of water in those locations. And you might say, oh, scarce locations. It makes sense if you're doing business in Saudi Arabia that would be a scarce location. Singapore is in that bucket also. So there are a lot of places where we do business where water is very relevant. And this kind of analysis has helped us focus our efforts to reduce water use on those places where it's most important. And the way we're doing that is through water recycle and improving the outflow quality of water. In many of our operations globally right now, the outflow water is cleaner than the inflow water. And that is just the nature of the requirements under which we operate. And I will tell you, as a former Baytown refinery manager, the water that comes in from the Houston Ship Channel is pretty crummy. The water that goes out is cleaner than what comes in. That's because largely the city of Houston doesn't do very much in terms of waste management. The other thing that we've been doing is we've been working with a group called GEMI, the Global Environmental Management Institute. They had some very good tools for diagnosing water use, but they didn't fit very well with our business. And so we and a couple of other companies have been working with them to create a tool that we are now using globally in all of our sites to kind of drill down and analyze our water use and look at the potential to essentially shift water demand to lower quality water. And the other thing we've been doing is working through some of the industry associations to improve both the practices around water and reporting. There's a group called IPECA, which is the International Petroleum Industry Environmental Conservation Association. IPECA is a set of companies, and the unique thing about IPECA is it is both shareholder-owned companies and nationally owned companies. And IPECA, about 5 or 6 years ago, put together a set of metrics, non-financial metrics for our industry. And then just over the last year, those have gone through a major update. They are the key sustainability metrics for the oil and gas industry. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to encourage those competitors that were above us on the list to report under those. You know, BP and Shell and we and the other majors that are shareholder owned, we're using those IPECA metrics. we're trying to get those companies above us on the list to also use those metrics. Because the reality for us as a business is the reputation for our industry is largely determined by those people above us on the list. And if they're not playing in this space of responsible environmental and social development, it's very hard for the industry to have a good reputation. And then the last thing we do is we actually have extensive research going on internally on ways to reduce our water use. And a good example is we've got some new technologies that are being researched that hopefully will reduce dramatically the amount of water involved in oil sands production. And we are also, if you went to one of our refineries or chem plants, probably the most common piece of equipment you would see are giant heat exchangers. And they generally are tube heat exchangers where a process fluid is flowing through the tube and you have some medium on the outside of the tubes. Often you will use water in the tubes and the process medium is on the outside of the tubes. If you have poor quality water, you plug those tubes up immediately, and it limits the life of the exchanger. You have to pull them offline and clean them or replace them. What we've been trying to do is design the metal coating for those tubes that will allow you to use poor quality water in them and still maintain the life. Now that may not sound like a lot, but our Singapore refinery right now is running 80% on gray water, which is recycled water. And they are really paying the price in terms of what it does to their heat exchangers. So this is the kind of technology development that's necessary. It's sort of brass tacks for a processing industry, but it's part of improving the performance in water. Okay, yes?
Technology such as that, is that something that Exxon does a lot of research on, or are there other independent companies that tend to do research on that then you invest in or try to?
That particular work is work that we're doing ourselves. Our research portfolio, I would say, is part what we do ourselves, and generally we work in areas where we have technology expertise, where we think we bring something to the party. We have a large portfolio of research where we partner with universities, and because we see somebody working in a particular area and we want to lock in with them. And then there is some research which is what I'll call the money goes over the transom and it goes into sort of an independently managed effort. We have right now at Stanford University a program which is a bit like that. It's called the Global Climate and Energy Project. It was founded about 10 years ago. And there are a handful of companies that pool resources there, and then Stanford actually disperses that money, not just to Stanford, but to universities globally. So sort of 3 different models. We only pick to do it ourselves if there is a research strength that we bring to it. We have, we spend about $100 billion a year on research ourselves. So it's 100 million, I'm sorry, not billion, $100 million a year on research. And so it's a significant activity for us, but we have to be very selective about what we do ourselves. Okay. Okay, now let me shift and talk about CO2 emissions. And you remember the charts I showed you earlier about our energy outlook. This is the implied CO2 emissions from energy that are consistent with that outlook. And it's an alarming trajectory. And if there is a good news here, when we start to look to 2040, that line is flattening out. Now, it is way off the trajectories that would be necessary for stabilization at lower parts per million in the atmosphere, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think it's definitely rising. You can see the growth is consistent with where the energy growth is globally, and the OECD is dropping. Yes?
Would you mind going through some of the assumptions behind the drop in emissions per capita in the OECD? I mean, do you assume that, for example, you know, the U.S. goes to a carbon tax or increased renewable energy?
Okay, what that question is really, what is behind the energy intensity improvements that we see that are in our outlook? And we do that at very granular level, country by country. So, for example, in the transport sector, we assume that by 2030, you've got somewhere around 15% of the light-duty vehicles in your fleet are advanced vehicles, where that there's a step change. They could be, most of them will be general hybrids, kind of the Prius type of hybrid. There may be a small penetration of electric vehicles. Now, we're a little bit agnostic on the exact policy which gets you there. It's going to be some combination of fuel price, vehicle price, and policy, but we're not specific on how. And I'm not going to talk about this, but we actually believe a carbon tax is the right approach to dealing with the risk of greenhouse gases. And in the Q&A session, I can talk more about that. But sort of sector by sector, we build up those assumptions, and we work with the various sectors. So we work with the car companies, we work with the electricity companies to make sure that our assumptions are credible. Now, will they happen? I don't know, but that's the basis of how we do that. And what you can see, though, the basis of the question was that in the OECD, the emissions per capita are much higher, but projected to come down. They're expected to rise in the non-OECD. If you look at it, emissions per GDP, you have the other picture. They're lower in the OECD and in the non-OECD, and both are projected to come down. So you essentially have the world moving toward one another, developed and non-developed, but still a projection for a pretty significant gap in 2030. Okay?
So is this projection what might be called a business as usual projection in an IPC?
We have an assumption in OECD countries of a $60 a ton cost on carbon effectively by 2030. I don't know whether you define that as business as usual or not. It is certainly lower than what would be necessary to drive deep reductions, but that's at 2030 we got $60 a ton in the OECD countries. We also have assumed that in non-OECD countries there will be some capacity for recognizing value from reductions there in the form of offsets, which can be taken back to the OECD countries. But I would characterize it as modest in the way they...
Business as usual, there actually is policy in place, but not policy in the non-OECD.
Well, we actually assume that China effectively has a low cost on carbon. They're not at $60 a ton, but they're low. And as we have started to go out beyond this to 2040, we start to see the effective costs in the non-OECD start to come up. And again, we're a little bit agnostic about how that cost gets there. It could be implemented as a result of mandates effectively, or it could be implemented through a carbon tax kind of program, or any number of policy options that are out there. But it's effectively $60 a ton. Now, the importance of that really is that if you follow the idea of carbon capture and storage as a really important opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we don't think it's economic at $60 a ton. So CCS is beyond that time frame in our outlook. Okay. Other questions? Great. All right. I thought I should tell you what our position is. This is sort of a credibility check. I think that there is very little question remaining that the global average temperature has risen over the last century. And notwithstanding the uproar around ClimateGate, the emails that came out of East Anglia in the UK, the trajectories for temperatures of the three major groups that estimate them are showing a rise. So that's sort of the first step. The second thing is that CO2 is clearly rising in the atmosphere, and if you look at the isotopes of the carbon, it comes largely from fossil fuels. So it is man-made impacts on the CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, the climate models that try and link those two are horrifically complex, but the bad news is that our climate systems are massively chaotic and very difficult to model. So you've got this huge fight about, is there attribution, and if so, how much? What is the projection for warming over time? And what we have said is, look, there is a serious risk here. We as a company deal with risk management all the time. And I mean, when you drill a hole, you don't know what you're going to find. It's risk management. So we feel that this is a risk management problem and it justifies people taking action. And that's individual people, governments, companies. Now the challenge is, particularly, and I work a lot in the policy space in this, the challenge is this is a very difficult policy problem. The first is that it's not cheap. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next chart. So it's incredibly important, particularly in the economic environment we're in right now, to make sure that policy is driving the lowest cost steps first. Because you want this policy to be effective and you want sustainable policy. That is, you want it to be sustained over time. And if it doesn't start by doing things on a responsible basis that gets the low-hanging fruit first, you're going to lose popular support for it. So one of the challenges is minimizing the overall cost, and that means doing the low-cost things first. And the other is you have to have global participation, and this is not news. This is a chart based on some work that was done at MIT. It was actually part of a study for the DOE, and they did what they called a business as usual trajectory, and I'll note this is actually carbon emissions, not CO2, so the units may look wrong to you. And you see the developing countries are the lower section and the developed countries. This is a business as usual, no cost on carbon over where they are. And there are an infinite number of pathways that will get you to stabilizing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere at any particular level. But these are indicative pathways. The green one would result in stabilization. You're on a pathway such that by the end of the century you would be on a pathway to stabilize at 450 parts per million. And the blue one is a 550 parts per million stabilization. The significance of the 450 is that the UN Framework Convention objective for a 2-degree centigrade warming limit is usually tied to the 450 target. And most of the policy discussions in Europe and in Washington have been focusing on 450. So the significance is that you see where this 450 line crosses the developed country line, the boundary between developed and developing countries. What that basically says is the developed world, even if it went to zero, if you don't have engagement in the developing world, you can't be anywhere near on these aggressive stabilization targets. Now, so that says one of the real challenges, and this is why the whole UN Framework Convention process is so difficult right now, is because they have to have broad agreement to make progress. Now, the other part of the challenge here, and I mentioned this when I said this is not going to be cheap. The IEA did this work a couple of years ago now, and they looked at what it would take to get a 50% reduction globally from 2005 by 2050, which would put you someplace between these two trajectories here. And they said it took an additional $45 trillion of investment in the energy infrastructure. You need new technologies. You can't do it with current technologies. And their technologies of choice were carbon capture and storage and advanced biofuels, cellulosic biofuels. And then they said, and then you have to grow the energy infrastructure. Each year between now and 2050, you have to add about 31 gigawatt nuclear power plants, 30 to 35, 500 megawatt coal plants with carbon capture and storage, and thousands of onshore and offshore wind turbines. This is a staggering amount of investment to be done every year. And this is probably not a good thing to admit, but I couldn't really relate to $45 trillion. You know, how much is that? So I turned this into something that I could relate to. Is I looked at the CCS associated with those coal plants, and I said, how much liquid CO2 is going to have to be injected into the ground for those 30 to 35 new coal plants each year? And the answer is 2.5 million barrels a day of liquid CO2. To put that in perspective, ExxonMobil's production of oil is about 2.5 million barrels a day. So suddenly this became real. Building an infrastructure every year to inject 2.5 million barrels a day of liquid CO2 is sort of like replicating ExxonMobil's liquid infrastructure every year. This is a staggering effort. And you know, one option is you can just throw up your hands and say, I don't know where to start. But where you really start, and this is kind of what we've concluded, is you start doing the things that make sense to reduce emissions in your own operations, and you start looking at technologies that can make a difference for the future. So let me talk about, this is where we are. The two major levers we have in our operations for reducing greenhouse gas emissions are flare reduction. And when we produce oil, sometimes there's come-along gas with it, and in some parts of the world there's no infrastructure to pipe that gas off for consumption. And so the gas gets flared. And figuring out how to put together projects in Nigeria and now in Iraq for us to capture the flaring is a big step. The second thing is just basic energy efficiency improvements in our operations. And one of the biggest steps that we have found to be effective is in cogeneration, or you might know it as combined heat and power. We operate or have part ownership in about 5 gigawatts of combined heat and power globally. It has been a great solution because we produce, instead of buying from a grid the power, we produce the power and then we use the heat either to produce steam for our operations or we directly heat integrate that heat source into our operations. And so you can see we've been making steady improvement off of a base of 2005. And here is our total greenhouse gases. And between 2006 and 2009, we had dropped 12%, and we were feeling pretty good. And then 2010 came along. A couple of things happened in 2010. Our business is bigger, and one of the places that we're growing is in Iraq. And Iraq came on with a huge amount of flaring because there is no infrastructure there for the gas. There are projects on the boards right now that will eventually capture that gas for consumption, but it hammered our numbers in 2010. Yes?
How much of this would you say is due to economic circumstances versus, implementation of different, technology?
There's almost no impact. Our business has been steadily growing, so we don't have, you don't have that economic impact showing up in there. If I had shown it, one way that we like to look at this is greenhouse gas intensity for each part of our business. So our refining business looks at their greenhouse gases per barrel of throughput. Our production looks at it per barrel of produced oil and gas. And all of those trajectories were coming down very nicely until 2010 when our upstream went whoop, and that was because of Iraq. So the flaring in Iraq has had a noticeable impact. And you can see here, the jump that we had was in our upstream. So, yes?
This trajectory looks very similar to the global trajectory, and is generally attributed to the economic downturn, but that's just coincidence.
It's total coincidence, yeah. Yeah, because we have actually had pretty steady volume growth over this time frame. Yeah. So there's our challenge. And one thing I have to say is, I read in other people's sustainability reports and they come in and they say, oh, well, we made a 30% reduction in our energy efficiency. And I'm going, you guys were asleep at the switch if you had 30%, potential for energy efficiency. One of my first jobs more than 30 years ago when I moved from research to refining was as an energy engineer for the plant. And we've had that kind of scrutiny because in a refinery, about half your operating cost is energy. So this part of the business is not new to us. And we are doing good if we get 1.5% per year energy efficiency reduction. In fact, we're leading the industry right now in terms of the pace at which we're improving efficiency. And it is a tough slog. But that's our challenge for now. Let me talk about the other thing we're doing, and that is research, because I mentioned you start by working sort of what you can do in your own operations, and then you start looking at what you can do from a research standpoint. And it's important to understand that if you look at a life cycle analysis for gasoline, and about more than 85% of the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions that come from a gallon of gasoline, come from when it's combusted on the vehicle. and less than 15% actually come from the operations to get it up to there. So we think it's really important not just to look at technology that affects our own operations, but also to look at the technology that will affect how the users use our fuels and emit. So this is a mix. Oil from algae. Some kinds of algae naturally produce oil, and they take sunlight and water and CO2 and produce that oil. The big challenge right now for biofuels is, of all kinds, is that the yield per acre is really poor. So it takes a lot of acres to make biofuels. The advantage that algae has is that already it's some 4 to 8 times more yield per acre than you get with conventional biofuels. The other thing is that you can do it with brackish water on land that is not suitable for growing other crops. So there's some optimism here that it might be viable. One of the things that we like about it, if you remember I said it takes CO2, we're looking at algae as a way to take CO2 streams off of a refinery. You bubble it through the ponds and it feeds the algae. The challenge is to make sure that the other things that are with the CO2 aren't pollutants to the algae, but they're nutrients to the algae. So it's getting algae who can be robust to handle the kind of CO2 streams that would come off of a power plant or off of a refinery. Because the amount of oil that you're going to make from algae will never replace the volume of petroleum that we have. But it may be a very viable way of disappearing CO2 and providing a valuable product in the mix. And we're looking at that. It's about we put about $600 million on the line here over a 10-year research plan. It's a stretch. I don't know whether this is going to be viable, but we thought of all of the options out there in the biofuel space, this made most sense to us. The middle one is actually some work we're doing with Georgia Tech. This gets back to the question you asked earlier about how we do this research. I should say, we are doing part of this ourselves, and for the biological part of this, we're working with Synthetic Genomics Incorporated, which is Craig Mentor's company. You know, he sequenced the human genome. And they're actually doing the biological work on the algae, and we're doing, if you will, the chemical engineering on how to make it work. So this work here is with Georgia Tech. And you know, I talked about carbon capture and storage. We do carbon capture and storage. We're partners with, in the Sleipner field in the North Sea, we're storing about 1 million tons a year there. Our Gorgon project in Australia is going to do full CCS. And the technologies that are necessary to do carbon capture and storage are on the shelf now. They're just expensive. And the expensive part of it is CO2 separation. Putting the stuff in the ground is generally, if you're doing it in a place where there is a deep reservoir that can accommodate it, you know, you can do that probably for $15 a ton of CO2. The separation right now, if you're using conventional amine technology, it's probably $60, $65, maybe even $70 a ton. So when you add those together, you're up to $80 a ton. If you can figure out a way to do CO2 separation cheaper, that's kind of the nut to crack to make CCS viable. And one of the things we're doing right now is working with Georgia Tech on a solid adsorbent for CO2. And it's actually laid down in these tubes so that you'd be running the processed gas through these tubes and it would be adsorbing through the tubes. And there's a lot of work to be done on this. This research program's been going on for several years, but they've made good progress. You know, it's not commercial yet, but it's got a glimmer of getting there. And the third thing here is we have an extensive research program that we do with the car companies. You know, essentially, we need to figure out how to help them make the fuel vehicle system more efficient. And so, for example, we've got research going on with Toyota on a system that could be on a Camry, it'd be the 2013 Camry. And it's about a 10% improvement in vehicle efficiency if it comes off. What's pictured here is a little more step out. This is a device that was put together, and it does onboard reforming to produce hydrogen. That is, it'll take a liquid hydrocarbon fuel and turn it into hydrogen on board the vehicle. And the reason you might want to do that is that you would use that hydrogen to put into a fuel cell. And a fuel cell inherently is thermodynamically about twice as efficient as the best internal combustion engine that we can envision. So in order to capture the inherent thermodynamic efficiency of a fuel cell, our conclusion is that it's best to make the hydrogen on board the vehicle. You don't have to worry about storing it. You don't have to worry about a big infrastructure to produce it and transport it. And this thing is remarkable it's just still too big. It fills the trunk of a car right now. There's a newer version that's a little smaller than this. And we've been looking for a partner right now to work with us to actually put this on a prototype vehicle of some kind. It could go on a forklift. It could go on a number of different vehicles. But this is what I'll call longer term development that could contribute to lower greenhouse gases in the transport sector. So that was the second focus. And this is my last chart. It's the same one you saw earlier, but I've added something to it. And this is something that I tell our businesses when I talk to them about sustainability. And that is that there are really two elements to making this whole framework work. One is performance, and the other is engagement. And you can't do one without the other. If you have performance and no engagement, which is a little bit the sort of the personality of ExxonMobil, we'd like to stay in the bunker. What happens is you don't get credit for the performance, and people throw rocks at you because they don't know what you're doing. So my challenge is to kind of encourage our operating organization to get out of the bunker and to engage. If you do it the other way around and you have engagement without performance, that's total greenwash, and that's not going to work. So my challenge inside the company really is working to get both of those elements out there, because I don't think that we're going to be a leader, viewed as a leader from a sustainability standpoint, unless we can make sure that both of those elements are part of it. So now let's do questions. Oh.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.